The tremor that ran through the corridors of Buckingham Palace at exactly 2:47 p.m. last Tuesday was not caused by construction work or passing traffic, but by the quiet, methodical, and absolutely devastating manner in which Prince William had just executed the most sophisticated assertion of heir apparent authority in modern royal history. What appeared to the outside world as a routine announcement about modernizing royal patronage frameworks was an institutional reality. The moment when the future King of England systematically dismantled 18 months of careful empire building by Queen Camilla's private office and permanently redrew the boundaries of power within the House of Windsor, the administrative empire that Camilla built to understand the magnitude of what William accomplished. You must first understand what he was confronting. Over the past year and a half, Queen Camilla's office had been implementing what they diplomatically termed the Royal Coordination Enhancement Initiative minus a modernization program that appeared on paper to be exactly the kind of administrative streamlining that efficiency experts had been recommending for decades. The stated goals were uncontroversial: reduce bureaucratic redundancy, improve information flow between household offices, create more effective coordination of the monarchy's charitable activities. But beneath this reasonable surface presentation, something far more consequential had been taking shape. Camilla's office had positioned itself as the indispensable hub through which information flowed to the king. Decisions were coordinated across household offices, and the monarchy's considerable institutional resources were allocated. They were not just streamlining communications, they were controlling which information reached Charles's attention, in what order, and with what contextual framing. They were not just coordinating charitable activities, they were determining which organizations received the institutional legitimacy that royal backing provides. Most significantly and most constitutionally problematic, this coordination framework had begun extending into areas that would survive the transition to the next reign. The Queen's office had quietly embedded their administrative preferences so deeply into the monarchy's operational infrastructure that they would continue to influence royal operations decades beyond Charles's death. This was not a gradual accumulation of influence through personal relationships. This was a deliberate, systematic transfer of institutional authority, executed through mechanisms so procedurally obscure that even senior palace officials had failed to recognize the pattern until William's investigation brought it to light. The decision that changed everything, the specific matter from which William excluded Camilla, was the restructuring of the Royal Foundation's charitable patronage framework, minus a decision that would determine how the monarchy's institutional backing is distributed among thousands of charitable organizations across the United Kingdom for the next generation. This framework represents more than ceremonial endorsements. It controls access to the kind of institutional legitimacy that can transform a small charity into a nationally recognized organization, that can unlock major funding streams, and that can provide the royal seal of approval that opens doors across British society. Under the coordination framework that Camilla's office had been developing, the Queen Consort's private office would have become the primary clearinghouse for these patronage decisions. The mechanism was elegant in its indirectness. Rather than claiming decision-making authority outright, Camilla's office would coordinate between the king's preferences, the prince's charitable interests, and the institutional continuity requirements that they themselves had defined. In practice, this coordination role would have given them effective veto power over patronage decisions while maintaining the appearance that final authority rested with the sovereign and heir apparent. The financial implications were staggering. The Royal Foundation's patronage network influences the distribution of approximately £2.80 billion annually across the British charitable sector. By positioning themselves as the coordination hub for these decisions, Camilla's office would have gained influence over resource flows that dwarf the operating budgets of most government departments. They would not have controlled this money directly, but they would have controlled access to the royal endorsement that unlocks it, minus a form of soft power that, in many contexts, is more valuable than direct financial authority. William's constitutional archaeology. Prince William did not stumble upon this situation by accident. For 14 months, he had been conducting what his advisors privately called constitutional archaeology, minus a systematic examination of how administrative changes within the royal household were affecting the institutional framework he would inherit as king. This was not casual oversight or family curiosity. It was a disciplined, legally rigorous investigation conducted with the assistance of constitutional experts whose knowledge of the monarchy's foundational legal structure goes well beyond the ceremonial familiarity that most palace officials possess. What Williams' investigation revealed was that the coordination framework Camilla's office had been implementing operated through a sophisticated exploitation of the gaps between formal constitutional authority and practical administrative control. Each individual change to palace procedures could be justified as a reasonable efficiency measure. The cumulative effect of these changes was a fundamental alteration of how institutional power flowed within the monarchy, minus an alteration that had been achieved without triggering any of the formal oversight mechanisms that are supposed to govern such changes. The documentation that Williams' team assembled was devastating in its thoroughness. 47 pages of meticulously recorded evidence showing how information flows had been redirected, how decision-making processes had been restructured, and how the Queen's office had positioned itself at the center of institutional arrangements that would bind future monarchs to administrative frameworks they had no role in creating. This was not a family complaint or an emotional grievance, minus it was a constitutional case file that left no procedural basis for dismissing Williams' concerns. The moment of institutional reckoning, Williams' exclusion of Camilla from the patronage framework decision was executed with surgical precision through mechanisms that most people inside the palace did not know existed. At 8:15 a.m. on the morning the framework was scheduled for final approval, Williams' principal private secretary delivered a formal notification to the Lord Chamberlain's office invoking the heir apparent's constitutional standing to review any administrative arrangement that could materially affect the exercise of sovereign authority by future monarchs. This was not a request that could be managed through private conversation or strategic delay. Once formally invoked, this constitutional mechanism created binding obligations that had to be addressed through institutional processes operating independently of personal relationships or family dynamics. Every aspect of the coordination framework that Camilla's office had developed was immediately frozen pending formal review by constitutional experts whose loyalty was to the institutional integrity of the crown, not to any individual member of the royal family. The financial leverage behind William's intervention was equally devastating. The Duchy of Cornwall contributes approximately £4.20 million annually to the shared administrative infrastructure of the royal household, but the true value of this integration extends far beyond direct cash transfers. When you calculate the full value of shared communication systems, coordinated security arrangements, and joint operational initiatives, the total reaches nearly £12 million annually. William's threat to withdraw this support and establish complete administrative separation between Kensington Palace and the rest of the royal household represented an existential challenge to the monarchy's operational stability. The mathematical reality was unforgiving. Total institutional leverage equals direct duchy contributions plus shared infrastructure. Value plus operational integration. Benefits total institutional leverage equals £4. 20 penny sim plus £5. 80 penny sim plus £12. It's equals £12 annually. The king's household budget could not absorb this kind of sudden shortfall without triggering exactly the kind of public scrutiny and parliamentary inquiry that the monarchy works desperately to avoid. The constitutional restoration by 11:30 a.m., the institutional reality had been fundamentally altered. King Charles, faced with his son's impeccable constitutional documentation and the threat of financial separation, authorized the complete restructuring of the patronage framework. Every role that had been designated for the Queen's office was either eliminated or transferred to existing constitutional authorities. Every coordination mechanism that would have survived into the next reign was subjected to formal review with explicit provisions for modification or elimination at the discretion of the incoming monarch. Queen Camilla learned of her exclusion when she returned from a morning engagement to find her principal private secretary waiting with news that 18 months of careful institutional positioning had been neutralized in a single morning. The sophisticated administrative network her office had built suddenly found itself operating under constitutional oversight that prohibited the very coordination activities that had been the source of their expanding influence. The message William sent through this intervention was of extraordinary clarity. The heir apparent had been watching, documenting, and had reached the point where institutional integrity required formal action, regardless of personal relationships or family comfort. He demonstrated that his years of patient preparation had produced not just a future king who could represent the monarchy effectively in public, but an institutional leader who understood the constitutional foundations of the crown with the precision that defending those foundations requires. The new institutional landscape, the immediate practical consequences of William's intervention extend far beyond this single decision. Every administrative arrangement within the royal household is now understood to be subject to constitutional scrutiny by someone with both the knowledge to identify overreach and the institutional standing to challenge it effectively. The era of quiet accommodation and gradual expansion of informal authority has been replaced by a framework of explicit constitutional boundaries that cannot be crossed without triggering formal institutional response. For Queen Camilla, the intervention represents a fundamental redefinition of her role within the monarchy's operational structure. She remains a working member of the royal family with genuine contributions to make to the crown's charitable and representational activities. But the expansion of that role into the administrative infrastructure that governs institutional decision-making has been permanently foreclosed by constitutional mechanisms that operate independently of personal relationships or political considerations. The broader implications reach into the very nature of how the British monarchy will operate during the remainder of Charles's reign and beyond. William has established himself as the ultimate guardian of the constitutional principles that govern the transfer of authority between reigns, prepared to deploy legal mechanisms sophisticated enough to counter even carefully planned expansions of informal power when those expansions cross institutional boundaries. The future of royal authority, what Prince William accomplished, represents more than a successful assertion of heir-apparent prerogatives. It represents a constitutional restoration executed by someone who understands that the monarchy's survival depends not on public popularity or media management, but on the unwavering maintenance of the legal frameworks that have allowed it to endure for over a millennium. The Crown's authority has been restored to its constitutional foundation, and the institutional message will echo through the corridors of power for the remainder of this reign and well into the next. The monarchy will endure, as it always has, because when its institutional integrity faces challenge, there are always those within the system prepared to defend it with every constitutional tool at their disposal. This week, that defender was the future King of England, and the precision with which he executed his intervention has permanently altered the landscape of royal power in ways that will shape the House of Windsor for generations to come.